All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have one last topic on building unicorns in intelligent electronics. Our last speaker for this day is Sudhir Sethi, founder and chairman, Chiratae Ventures. I'd like to request all of you to please give him a big round of applause as I invite him to deliver his presentation.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for inviting me here. I've listened to the last session and very impressive. Just a little bit about us and the topic. We are venture investors in India. Which one is like that? Okay, backward. And we've been investing in India for over 12 years right now. My topic, which I was given, was a very easy topic, how to build unicorns in the country. So I thought I'll sort of delve upon that. I was very impressed by the earlier speakers in terms of the detail. There's a lot of hardware companies, a lot of robotic companies in the country space. I must say that we've seen many of them. We've invested in, I think, in 7. We are extremely impressed by the quality of intellectual property, by the quality of patents being filed, and the quality of competitive products now being produced in the country. So fundamentally, unicorns happen in 2 ways, by design and by accident. If you look at the presence of many of these large companies in the world, they're very fundamental, and this, by the way, doesn't change for hardware, doesn't change for software. There are 5 or 6 key elements to scaling. One, a very strong risk-taking team. This is DNA. If you look at most of the unicorns in the country and outside, there's a risk-taking team, which is very, very important there. Leadership, who can actually hire teams which are better than themselves. A unique product offering. It's increasingly becoming important that the product offering broadly has 2 elements. One is very unique to India because there's an India problem and you have to solve the India problem. The other is if you're building a company for global markets, then it has to compete with global markets overall. So effectively, in most of the companies we've seen, the India market is very small, and if we have to scale to an international level, then that's a step towards becoming a large unicorn. Then to that extent, the product has to be competitive and very differentiative on a global basis. The market large, rapidly growing, that's very crucial. Last one I won't touch. I think there was an electronic policy which came out today. I won't comment on it, but I'll focus on the second last. What we have seen, and this play is very, very crucial, whether the end result is a unicorn or a successful 50 crore company or a successful 500 crore company. For a 50 crore company, I think the capital play is to reinvest cash flow and you can scale. There's no question about it. However, the time taken is a much, much longer time taken. The definitions as an investor of, let's say, a large play, because the commoditization of products is so heavy right now and so fast on a global basis, as somebody was saying earlier, that if you build a product, somebody else will come and tomorrow build a product for 1/10 the price, you've lost your competitive edge. So to that extent, the amount of capital which goes into building very large, successful global companies, and by definition, unicorn means large, successful global company. To me, that's very crucial because the Indian market is not large enough. The capital requirement becomes crucial. More important, it's not just one-time capital requirement, it's a supply chain of capital requirement. You have angel, then after that you have Series A's and B's and C's and D's and all the alphabets which are necessary to build a large company. Fundamentally, is that something available? And that's the question I will address in this next 10 minutes or so. Let me just see what's happening in the world. Many years ago, I was asked to go to Siltera in Malaysia, and I spent 2 days in bunny suits, and I found that my investor was telling me, go and invest in India in semiconductor. By the way, this was 2000, and there was no semiconductor at that time in India. But those 2 days, I learned a few things. First, the capital, I think the lead investor had only put in 3 million, and the balance 600 odd million was put by the Malaysian government. And when I was standing inside Siltera, I was told that almost double the acreage was around Siltera for supply chain. So effectively, the playbook for building supply chain had already started before the fab came in. Now that's very crucial, and I'll touch upon it a little bit earlier. I was reading a newspaper report, and that is that there's Samsung's largest factory in the world, perhaps in Noida, and 70% of the components are imported. So effectively, if we have to have manufacturing of IP which is held by others outside India, then supply chain becomes very necessary. Otherwise, you'll still import components, which is good. That's fine, because we consume 200 million cell phones a year or smartphones a year. But if supply chain doesn't happen, you can't build an industry. Interestingly, the amount of capital which gone in is written there, but that amount of capital, if you start a fab today, is probably fivefold. It's not the same. Indian IT industry, by the way, only in the last 5 years has been funded for $30 billion, and the annual revenues, of course, the industry is at 175. But in the last 5 years, $30 billion worth of risk capital has come into the software industry. If you take 3D printing globally, the mean funding for unicorns is at $300 million plus. I learned a word from the founders of Traction called Sunicorn, which is about to become unicorns. And the mean funding there was about half that. Space technology. The biggest hindrance to space technology companies in India is they're not allowed to operate from India. They're not allowed. You can't, one of the fundamental issues of Team Indus was that you can't change your cap table. You can't compete with ISRO. That doesn't make sense. So I don't think space companies in India will survive because government regulations do not allow you to launch from India. However, the mean funding is about $1 billion, and Sunicorn's at 180 million. In India, the total capital which has gone, and if you divide by the number of companies, is 6 million. Semiconductors globally, average mean in very large, successful unicorn companies, and I think the total number of unicorns in semiconductors is probably 17 or 20, is 275 million. Average Sunicorn, 165. Total mean funding in India for semiconductor is 13. And the list goes on. The point is very important. We are at the very early stage of the hardware industry in India. We can take two views about it. One is, oops, the gap is so large it cannot be bridged. I don't think that's the playbook which I'm going by. I think the gap can be bridged. But the gap has to be bridged by significantly scaled thinking. We seen in other industries which I've been involved in at least, the scaled thinking ahead of time in building does not happen. And the biggest reason is we don't allocate enough capital. And I'll give you some examples after that. So if we want to build large globally competitive companies in this industry which all of you represent, it's a 10 to 15 year cycle. It involves risk capital of order of magnitude between 10 to 100 times more than what it is today. So the fundamental premise, gentlemen and ladies, I want to put forward to you is in this industry, if this industry has to build very fast, it needs more capital. It needs significantly more capital to fund innovation at all stages of the food chain of capital. If I look at the hardware in India, past 7 years, total capitalization is $1 billion. Number of companies, Series A, 40, and list goes on. Very few investors. 4 companies have crossed a valuation of 100 million plus. It's a great start. The question is, how do we go forward? How do we look at going forward? Interestingly, majority of the startups for markets have to go to the US, and for supply chain have to go to the Chinese market. Satish was mentioning Emotics. We are investors in Emotics. It's a consumer robotics company. And Sneh, the founder, spends a large part of his time in building supply chain in China. Building supply chain is not after you design the product, as you all know. Building the supply chain is while you design the product, because you have to integrate at the time. You have to design for cost. You have to design for the customer as such, and which is what we liked about him. Just to give you an example, capital raised by non-hardware companies so far in the last 10 years to reach their large, globally competitive scale is given here. It varies between, on the lower side at 300 million to the higher side of 7 billion. Now, I'm not saying 7 billion is what is required, but I think it's important to start thinking in some of our hardware companies, and how do we get to 100 to 200 to 300 million capital? To me, if that does not happen, right, we are not playing the right playbook, okay? We are not playing the right playbook, and that only this association or this industry can think of, because hardware, to my mind, will require more capital. It does. It requires more risk. It requires a longer time play, because there are, on one side, if you go to industrial, there's safety issues. You know, you go to the railways industry, a safety certification takes 3 years. Okay? So how do you build a propulsion system for the railways? Okay? How do you build for space? Okay? How do you build just the satellite? There's other issues which are there. I'm glad there are many microsatellites coming up now, and overall. So if that is the case, just a comment that we have seen so many companies as investors in the country, and we are extremely impressed by the quality. We are extremely impressed by the design elements. We are extremely impressed by the IP, the number of patents filed, and the number of patents which are under progress. Fundamentally, we did some back-of-the-envelope math, so I took the risk of doing that. If we take about 40 companies in the country, and these are, by the way, not those names. I'm saying we've done a little bit of homework and said, hey, let's choose, in our view, what are those companies? We believe that those 40 to 45 companies who we believe can scale on a global basis, what's the capital requirement of these companies in the next 5 to 7 years? It came out to a very interesting $500 million. Okay? Now the question is, where does it come from? In investor base in India, it is not there. So how do we get this money? By the way, if this capital pool does not come to these 40 companies, and by the way, these people who have listed here, they are all struggling to raise the next round of capital. They are all struggling to raise. Some of them may be much better, but fundamentally, I've seen companies get stuck at Series A because the supply chain is not there. Many of our companies are getting stuck at Series B. And after that, there is no investor who can actually put $10 to $20 million. None. Okay? Strategic investors have their own agenda, which is good for them, but they're not financial investors. So if that base, the material for success exists in the country, what do we do? Key challenges, there's a broken chain, we know that. We need to get 500 million organized. How do you do it? Many ways. First and foremost, I think we need to fund 3 or 4 or 5 companies to a bigger scale. And that can happen only if people get together, funds get together, associations get together. The question is, does India have the money? I've given some examples, the fact that India has money, and most of you may not know this. The total dividends by the IT services company and the share buybacks in the last 10 years have crossed $50 billion. How many of you knew that? Okay? If I just take that amount and say, hey, give me $500 million, I think it should be easy. But no, it's not that easy, because they have to face markets, capital markets, and so on and so forth. So, at any point of time, the IT companies have a standing cash flow available, free cash flow of $1.5 billion. This is the top 10 companies. My colleague sitting here, Ashwin, he's the researcher here. And Family wealth in India, most of you or many of you may be part of that, is $3 trillion. It has grown 4x. So what happens? Dividend comes out, share buyback happens by the company, but dividend comes out, it goes into wealth. And that wealth has grown 4x, by the way, in the last 10 years. It's 3 trillion today. This is published reports. By the way, investments in PVC of this asset is less than 0.5%, which means we have to now fundamentally go and say, how do we get more risk capital into this industry? It's not going to be easy, but it's very important. I would encourage this team to discuss that, because if you don't put this like a small panel or a small set of people, 5, 6, 10 people to go and address this issue, you will not have successful companies from India scaling to a global level because there's no capital here. So, sector needs about $500 million in the next 5 to 7 years. And we went through those 30, 40 companies. There are about 20 odd who need Series A's. There's more B's. And once they cross the Series C hurdle, they're off to a great start. We need to get them to a Series C hurdle. And only 4 companies have crossed Series C in the whole country. So there is this narrative, which is extremely important, and I believe it's been reasonably successful, startups, which is, let's go and start another incubator. While that happens, I would urge all of us here to go and start larger funds. There is, to my mind, no need for one more incubator in the hardware space. There are enough incubators in the country. Let's go and put larger pools of capital to make some of those companies successful, and you will find that they become role models now. Once they become role models, that's an evolution, it's not a revolution. You'll find more startups happening. The pace, I mean, we as a fund see about 2,500 startups every year. The number of hardware startups is decreasing every year. It is not increasing. It is decreasing, right? Maybe because we are not that focused, but fundamentally to us, it is decreasing. If that has to happen the other way around, some companies have to get successful. At least we know who those companies are. Okay? So with this, I'll end the session. Thank you very much. Do we have time for Q&A, or I can go? Yeah, sure.
I think we'll take 2 questions and stop at that.
Yes, please.
So you said 4 companies, right? Successful or going to be successful in this sector, right? And role models. So if I look at company like Tejas, right? They are a prototype example of basically building a hardware solutions company. I'll not say product company alone, but so what basically worked there? Okay, and when we talk for capital, a company like Udaan can basically raise the capital very fast, become unicorn in 2 years. At least I don't think there is a serious differentiation there. What works for those and what doesn't work for basically a company like Perfint or basically for us or any of those things which you have been involved
Yes.
in, right? So.
You mentioned Tejas. Most people may not know that Tejas and Huawei started at almost the same time, plus minus few years, right? When the Huawei products came out, they were almost the same size. However, what the difference was that the Chinese government changed the specs of what could be sold into China, and only Huawei could meet them. So if you look at the history of Tejas, I believe Tejas is a phenomenal company. I know the founders very well, and they've done a wonderful job, but the adversarial effect of Ericsson's wiping out the domestic market was very bad. If you look at C-Dot was manufacturing world-class telephone exchanges. But once they reached 1 million lines, the government fundamentally allowed Ericsson and a few others to come in. I think it's time we start thinking about promoting our own companies. And I do not mean forever, but all hardware is a long-term play. It's a domestic play. Unlike software, it's a domestic play. We need 200 cell phones a year. We need, billions of phone lines in a year. Well, now phone lines are not there as such. But if you look at fundamentally the hardware market in the country, we import about $9 to $10 billion worth of medical devices every year. $9 to $10 billion. Electronics imports into the country are, I think, bigger than gold right now. And they're headed towards being bigger than oil, right? Any country, when it imports electronics for domestic consumption, it's like food. Electronics is like food today. If you import food, you cannot survive because somebody will turn the switch off. So I think if you go to the history of many of these companies, you will find something which the government has done across the world, by the way. As far as people like Forus and this thing is concerned, they need another 100 million each, by the way, to scale to a level which is unbelievable.
That's understood, but if a Udan or Danzo can basically raise that kind of the money, why can't Forus? What is the basically so different between two business basically propositions?
Lack of knowledge of investors, I think, is the big one, because over a period of 10 years, investors have become more knowledgeable about a certain space. So there are not many investors in the hardware space. So it's not one playbook, it's many playbooks overall. Okay?
Good evening. One more question.
Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Ladies and gentlemen, on that note, we'll bring to a close that session. I'd like to request Mr. Rajesh Ram Mishra, President IESA, to present a small token of our appreciation to Mr. Sudhir Sethi. Sir, if you could just please come back on stage for just a minute. Once again, on behalf of IESA, we'd like to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Sudhir Sethi, founder and chairman, Chiratae Ventures. Thank you very much indeed, sir, for being here with us.